All right, so we're starting with the last packet here, gastrointestinal system, control, secretion, and motility. Our first objective here is to describe the role of the short reflex pathway and the long reflex pathway, and then talk about some of the hormones that are involved in controlling digestive function. So we will start out with kind of this overview here. And again, if you aren't able to write this down, I really rather you kind of follow what I'm explaining, and I will post these with the recordings today. So don't feel rushed to kind of scribble all this down since I already have it written. I will also share these with you. You'll have them as PDFs that you can review and just kind of recreate in your own time as well. So a couple of things about GI regulation. So we talked about all the structures, we talked about generally their function. And then as we usually do with our systems, at the very end, we talk about how we regulate things, really involving the nervous system as well as hormones. One exception that we see with the gastrointestinal system is that it does not obey homeostasis. And what that means is that there's going to be continual absorption of nutrients regardless of the body's energetic state or energetic demands. And that's not true with other systems, right? If you think about the nervous system, it's going to regulate the flow of action potential so that it can increase them if it needs, decrease if it needs. If you think about the heart, it's going to vasodilate in some areas, vasoconstrict in others to keep flow constant. If we think about any other system, the kidneys that we just talked about, if we think about blood pressure, pH, some of those other variables, they're all regulated so that there is neither excess nor diminished quantities, right? There's a regulation for a balance. In the GI system, there is maximum absorption of nutrients regardless of what the body needs. And so, it would have been nice if the GI were to say, stop absorbing if it had enough calories, if it had enough nutrients, but it does not. It just continually absorbs as many calories or as many nutrients as are presented. And that can obviously become a problem with things like obesity, where there's this overnutrition, especially in westernized society. So that is because of this lack of homeostasis that's seen with GI regulation. As far as how things are regulated, we see that there's neural regulation, so neural input involving the enteric nervous system. This has to do with the submucosal plexus that we talked about, which is the Meissner's plexus, as well as the myenteric plexus, which we talked about being the Auerbach's plexus. So the submucosal being in the submucosa, the myenteric being in the muscularis externa. And this is an intrinsic means of regulation. Intrinsic meaning very similar to what we saw in other systems, the local levels of regulation. So the gut regulating the happenings within the gut itself. There's also the central nervous system communication. And while the central nervous system, autonomic nervous system included, can communicate to the enteric nervous system, this is going to be an extrinsic division. So these two branches of the nervous system, these two sets of neurons and this neural regulation are sharing communication with each other, but one is intrinsic, controlling things from a local perspective, whereas the CNS and autonomic nervous system are controlling things from an extrinsic or an external perspective, okay? There are also hormones that regulate the GI function here. So there's gastrin. We'll talk about the function of gastrin, but we did already point out that it is released from the G cells of the stomach. We'll talk about cholecystokinin or CCK and secretin. These are both released from the duodenum, both involved in regulation of bile, regulation of bicarbonate. We'll talk about that more as well coming up. And then glucose-independent insulinotropic peptide. We won't speak as much about this one, but this also is released from the duodenum and has an influence on insulin release. And so it's going to be stimulated if there's, a lot of carbohydrates that require that insulin, that glucose to be absorbed in the blood. All right. So again, we will speak much more about CCK and secretin coming up and how they play an intimate role in regulating what's happening in the duodenum. I want you to bear in mind, however, that these are hormones. So they're not being released into the duodenum, into the lumen of the duodenum. They are being released into the blood, okay? And then they're going to have effects and some of the organs and the structures that we'll talk about. Okay, so that's going to be an endocrine form of communication there. Okay, so let's get into distinguishing these two reflex pathways. So we have two mechanisms for communication that happen from the time we see or smell or think about food all the way to actual secretion of fluids and digestive enzymes and juices, and then the actual motility of the gut itself. So the first one is the short reflex pathway. This is intrinsic regulation. So this is regulation that does not involve the external influence of the nervous system, of the central nervous system that is, or the autonomic nervous system. It doesn't involve the brain or the spinal cord. That's going to be kind of a shortcut, and I'll talk about why that's a shortcut when I explain this here. The long cut, or the long way around things, is going to be involving the central nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. That's going to be the long reflex pathway, and it's going to take many more steps, so that's why we can think of it as the long way of communication. And so we'll talk about how these differ here. So the first thing that happens, and I'm going to explain the long reflex pathway first, and then we'll talk about the shortcut. But the long reflex pathway starts with stimulus. So stretch of the stomach by the physical presence of food, that is detected by mechanoreceptors. We can also see chemoreceptors detecting the actual molecules, so detecting the carbohydrates and the glucose that begins to be broken down to. We can also be detecting the proteins, or the micronutrients, if there's sodium in that meal or potassium in that meal. Those things can be detected by the chemoreceptors in different regions. And then finally, we have osmoreceptors, and osmoreceptors detect any fluid that's coming through in the contents. So a lot of fruits and foods in general have fluid within them, have water content to them, and that is what is picked up by the osmoreceptors. So essentially, the physical presence of food triggers one of these three receptors that begins this whole pathway. That sends signals directly to the central nervous system. So the taste buds, the receptors that are on these taste buds or in the oral cavity will be sending signals up to the central nervous system. This can also receive inputs that are not physical. So emotional inputs that are coming into the cerebral cortex, the sight of food, the smell of food, things that are coming in from the hypothalamus, the memories of food, the visions of food that we may have or project. So those things can feed into this long reflex pathway as well. So we're thinking about physical stimuli as well as some non-physical stimuli that can be communicated from other areas of the brain as well. So all this gets put into the central nervous system, those integrating centers there, and then the outputs are going to be via the autonomic nervous system. Now, because of the comparative secrecy, we would have talked about this comparative secrecy with the autonomic nervous system, it's not enough to just signal or to increase the stimuli to one division. We also have to shut off the opposing division. I would have talked about that many times before. So as a part of doing that, because the parasympathetic system is the system that controls the rest and digest, we're going to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system, but likewise, we're going to block or inhibit the sympathetic nervous system as well, okay? And those actions together are going to feed forward onto the enteric nervous system. So although I mentioned these as being separate divisions, the autonomic being extrinsic or external, enteric being local, they still are speaking to each other and are involved in communication of the general signals that are happening here. From the enteric nervous system, we have a couple of options. We can either signal directly to our effector cells. So the enteric nervous system being a part of the gut, remember it's in the submucosa as the submucosal plexus, it's in the muscularis externa as the myenteric plexus. And so it can directly stimulate the smooth muscle cells of the tract itself to start contracting. They can also directly stimulate the glands and the other cells that are in the GI tract itself to directly have secretion and motility. But then there's another pathway where the enteric nervous system can send signals to the endocrine system. This is going to be involving the hormones that I mentioned previously. So that's the secretin release, that's the CCK release, that's the GIP release, that's the gastrin release. Because these things are hormones, they're going to be released into the blood, and we're going to think about this as being that endocrine route of communication, but it's going to lead to the same exact events. That is glandular secretion to help with the breakdown, right? If it's pancreatic secretion, if it is bilious secretion, if it's got enzymes in there, all that secretion is going to help with the breakdown. And then we can also stimulate the smooth muscle cells to actually start contracting. That is going to bring about the motility. All right. So that was the long reflex pathway from our stimulus to the central nervous system, to the autonomic nervous system, stimulating parasympathetic, but blocking sympathetic, to our enteric nervous system, directly to our effector cells, or from our enteric nervous system to the endocrine system, which stimulates those hormones I mentioned that will sort of indirectly result in effector cell response, okay? The short reflex pathway is going to be excluding or anything that does not involve central nervous system. So this is going to be from the stomach onwards. And that's going to go from the chemoreceptors, the mechanoreceptors, the osmoreceptors that are from the stomach, that are in the intestines, anything below the level of the stomach. So this is not including the head. This is not including the taste buds, the sight or the smell of food. And so it's not including the central nervous system. And so the short reflex path was going to go directly from those receptors all the way to the enteric nervous system, again, bypassing central nervous system, bypassing autonomic nervous system, okay? And that is going to be kind of the shortcut that we can take as far as the communication from the time we had the stretch in the stomach all the way to seeing secretion and motility. Alrighty, okay. So that's it as far as these different pathways, and we'll talk more about the different phases that they're involved in when we kind of move on and look at the 3 phases of digestion and regulation. Okay, so let's look at the phases here of gastrointestinal control, and really important to, again, connect the phases to what we just talked about as far as those pathways. So the cephalic phase is where we start things from in the head. So this is thoughts of food, taste of food in the mouth, the taste buds picking that up, smell of food with the olfaction. This can even be the hearing, right? This can also include some auditory components. I know, for example, when I hear those obnoxious Arby's commercials, I automatically start, salivating, and, because of that associated hearing of that continuous stimulation. This is always involving the long reflex because it is always involving the central nervous system. So our thoughts, our taste, smell, olfaction, even auditory stimulation must be inputted in the central nervous system. And so it must include the long reflex only. It cannot involve the short reflex because we cannot bypass the central nervous system. The second phase of gastrointestinal control is the gastric phase. This starts in the stomach. And because it starts in the stomach, it can definitely bypass the central nervous system. It can involve the central nervous system as well, but it can also, there's also an option to bypass the central nervous system and directly stimulate gastric motility and secretion without the involvement of autonomic nervous system or central nervous system input. So the gastric phase involves long and short reflex pathways, as well as the hormones that are the endocrine component as well. The third phase is the intestinal phase. This starts further down, so it starts in the small intestine. Again, same deal here. It can bypass the central nervous system. It can also include the central nervous system. So there are 2 options for the pathway here. It can be the long reflex pathway or the short reflex pathway. And then we can also have the input of the hormones with the endocrine system as well. So main takeaway message here is that the cephalic phase cannot involve the short reflex pathway. It can only involve the long reflex pathway because it cannot bypass the central nervous system. All of the stimuli that are coming into the mouth all the stimuli that are being received in the head, essentially, the thoughts, the taste, the smells, all of those things must be inputted onto central nervous system and then have that autonomic nervous system involved before they can signal the enteric nervous system. Okay. Let's see, question here. So someone's saying, would the cephalic phase involve seeing too? Yes, absolutely. So just the sight of food, I'm sure we've all experienced this. If you're just looking at a meal, you start salivating, right? The sensation of just seeing that food, the thoughts about the food, you can already start salivating and begin that cephalic phase, although the food has not physically been present in the oral cavity. So again, it's not just involving thoughts, taste, and smell. So pretty much any sensory perception, auditory perception, visions, if you have, just thoughts about a meal being prepared, memories, all of those things can feed in here and start, the salivating, that cephalic phase of gastrointestinal